Well, today we get to jump into John chapter 19 in our study through the Gospel of John called Life in His Name. And the title of this message is Irony and Identity. Well, I'm about to spoil Romeo and Juliet for you. I'm going to talk about the end. And you can't exactly fault me, and I'm not going to apologize for it because you literally had 400 years to catch up, okay? So get with the program. If this is offensive to you, I'm going to spoil this great play by Shakespeare. The very climactic scene of Romeo and Juliet, when all of the tension and all of the action comes together, Juliet has drugged herself and fallen into such a deep sleep that she appears dead, and she's done it in order to escape her impending arranged marriage. And she's done it because she loves Romeo and she wants to run off with him. And she thinks, if I fake my death, they'll cancel the wedding and then me and Romeo can ride off into the sunset and it's going to be awesome. Romeo, however, doesn't know that that's her plan. He just hears that Juliet has fallen dead on the eve of her wedding. And so Romeo comes running to where Juliet is. And he sees her, believes that she's dead, and so filled with grief, he kills himself. And then in the moments following his death, Juliet awakes from her drug-induced slumber, finds Romeo dead, and in response, because of her grief, she kills herself. And it's like the ultimate tragedy. Everything goes exactly the opposite of how it should go. And the reason that that is such a powerful literary symbol of what we call dramatic irony is because you know something that they don't know. And so the whole time that you're watching this scene unfold, whether you're reading it on the page or seeing it come to life on the stage, you are looking at the characters and you're thinking to yourself, no, don't do it. Stop. If you just knew what I knew, if you saw what I see, you would never act how you are acting. And that's the draw of it. That's the pull of it, is that dramatic, tragic irony. And in these verses that begin John chapter 19, we are about to encounter incredible, tragic irony. Far more tragic than the Romeo and Juliet story, because what we're going to see is we're going to see Jesus Christ, the spotless, eternal Son of God, and we're going to see him treated in a way that he should never be treated. And if we're responding appropriately to what we're going to read, it will be like that moment in the play where we will see what they do to Jesus and how they speak to him and how they treat him, and something in us will say, no, don't you get it? Don't you see who he is? Don't you know what he is like? Don't you know where he came from and what he came to do? Everything in us will cry out, don't do it. And we're supposed to feel that way. That's, in fact, I believe what John intends us to feel and to see as we read this account, because the tragic irony of what we will read is going to teach us something about who Jesus truly is. So let's read it together. John chapter 19, beginning in verse 1. Remember, this is the word of God for us this morning. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing a crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "Will you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. Verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." And they cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. The big idea in this section of God's word is this: when Jesus is tried, the tragic irony reveals his true identity. As Jesus undergoes this final section of his trial before Pontius Pilate, we're going to see him treated in a way that is the exact opposite of the way that he should be treated. And as we see that, it is the very pain of the contrast and the injustice that cries out that's going to reveal to us something about who Jesus actually is. There's something about the visceral reaction that we're going to have to seeing him treated the way he's treated that's actually going to show us, in effect, a contrast, a mirror image of the way that Jesus actually deserves to be treated because of who Jesus actually is. And this morning, it's so important for us to remember that everyone, everywhere, at all times, the people in this room included, everyone is responding to the identity of Jesus in some way. You, right now, in the life that you live, in the heart that you have right now as you sit there in that seat, you are responding to the identity of Jesus in some way. And the question that we're going to ask and answer as God's word functions as a mirror for us this morning is, am I treating Jesus in a way that is tragic or a way that is appropriate? Is my response to his identity, is it in accord with who he actually is, or does it fall far, tragically short of Jesus' true identity? What is the true identity of Jesus that we see here, and how are we supposed to respond to it? We're going to respond with the polar opposite of how the people in this story treat him. And so as we move through the text, we're going to see 4 responses to his true identity. There are these glimpses of who Jesus actually is that shine through because of the depth of the irony of the abuse and the violence that he endures here. And the first response to his true identity is this: bow to Jesus as the real king. Bow to Jesus as the real king. Pilate, having tried once to release Jesus and failed because of the overwhelming cries of the crowd, John now is going to give us a glimpse of what Pilate does next in his treatment of Jesus, and it's much worse. First, verse 1 says, "Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him." That's a very short sentence, and it's very understated, but it carries with it a very violent reality. That Jesus was taken and he was stripped of his clothes, he was tied to a post, and he was brutally and violently whipped with straps of leather on the end of a stick that would most likely have sharp objects attached to it, so that his skin on his back would be flayed open and he would be a bloody mess. He was flogged. This was a common Roman punishment, but it was so violent and detestable that it was actually forbidden to be enacted on Roman citizens because it was considered such a low form of punishment. And then after that, verse 2, "And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe." An adornment that's intended to confer glory instead is twisted together into a sadistic torture instrument, and these thick thorns, most likely from a date palm, which are these giant, giant thorns, are twisted together in a little garland, and they're jammed down on the scalp of Jesus until it pierces him. And then a purple robe, most likely kind of a red-colored, purple-colored rag somewhere that they pick up off the ground, is thrown around Jesus's bloody mess of a body, and he sits there so that he can receive what's in verse 3. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they struck him with their hands. So just imagine the scene. Jesus has been physically brutalized. And then even beyond that, he has been denigrated to the point of now being mocked as a fake king. They twist this torture instrument of a crown, jam it on his head, throw the purple robe over him, and he sits there beaten and bloodied. And they say, "Hail, King of the Jews," while they punch him in the face. Now, it would seem that this was an attempt by Pilate to placate the kind of bloodthirsty rage of this crowd. Because in verse 4, it says, Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Now pause for a second and think about how twisted that is. Think about how he has just authorized his soldiers to treat a man he just said was innocent. And yet, in verse 5, it says, "So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, 'Behold the man.'" What we're going to see in this passage all the way throughout is that Pilate is caught between his apparent conviction that Jesus is innocent, but the immense pressure and anger of this violent mob. He's caught in between. And so he brings Jesus out as if to say to them, "Look at him. Behold the man. Look at all of the damage that I have inflicted upon him. Isn't that enough? Is the whipping and the beating and the mockery and the pain that he has experienced, behold the man. Is this guy really a threat? Can't we let him go?" It's as if that's what Pilate is saying. There's something so, if your heart, when you read this, if there's something that just feels repulsive about this, then you're responding rightly. You're supposed to feel disgusted by what you see here. It's awful. There's something that just hurts us about seeing something so precious and so beautiful treated so badly. There's this new form of kind of like ridiculous first world protest. I don't know if you've seen this, but people will like go to museums or installations where there are very valuable pieces of historical art, and they will bring like food or paint with them, and they will throw the food at the pieces of art as some sort of protest against, they're just like raging against, I don't know, society or something, or they will stick super glue on their hands and they will try to slap the canvas. Now, most of the time, if it's valuable enough, it's like behind glass, so they do nothing, and you're like, wow, that was all for a whole lot of nothing. But there's it's become this like social media fueled type of protest, and there's something so wrong about it. You're like, don't you understand that that's like a beautiful piece of art, and what you're doing is trying to attack it and in some way destroy it and denigrate it? You can just feel the gap between the beauty and the value of the art and the abuse that it receives. And Jesus being treated this way is that effect to the 10 millionth degree. Jesus is the most precious and beautiful and pure being that has ever existed. He is God in human flesh. And yet here in this moment, Pilate and his soldiers abuse and mistreat him, and they do it so that they can ridicule him and mock him as a fake king. Here's the real problem of this text, though. Jesus is not a fake king. He is the real king. That's what's been so mind-boggling about studying this gospel and all that transpires to lead Jesus to the cross, because Jesus is the real king. He is the creator God in human flesh, and he rules and reigns over all time and eternity. He just told Pilate last week that he is the king of a kingdom from another world, and that he right now is submitting himself to this mockery and this abuse. But one day it will not be that way. One day, no one will stand over Jesus in authority. One day, no one will mock him and no one will denigrate him. The day is coming when Jesus' kingship and his rule and his reign over everything visible and invisible will be obvious to every eye. And the scriptures say that the day is coming when one day every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. That's the same Jesus right now that is being denigrated and mocked and abused. So when we see this paragraph and we see this tragic irony of the way that Jesus is treated, it should speak to us of his true identity. We see these soldiers mock him as a fake king, and we are the people who fall down before him and honor him as the real king. He is not a fake king. He is not worthy of mockery. He is the king of eternity, and he is worthy of our submission and our worship. Now, it's possible for you and for me to refuse to act in an openly hostile way towards Jesus. You've never physically met Jesus. He's not bodily here present on the earth. And so maybe you think, well, I've never hit him. I've never spit on him. I've never jammed a crown of thorns on his head. And yet it is possible to make a mockery of his kingship simply by pretending that it doesn't exist. That's a far more common way to dishonor him in his true identity, that you and I will live our lives as if we are the real king. We are the real queen. We are in charge of our lives. But if we are going to respond to what we see here and what we see revealed through all of John's gospel, we will be the people who will refuse to dismiss his authority, who will refuse to run away from him, but instead who will joyfully fall before him and bow to the real king. We bow to King Jesus. When Jesus is tried, the tragic irony reveals his true identity. The first response is to bow to him as the real king. Here's the second response: to worship Jesus as the eternal king. Worship Jesus as the eternal king. Verse 6, when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." So Pilate says, "Hey, isn't this enough?" And they look at him and say, "Nope, still not enough. Kill him. Kill him." And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." That's hard to tell whether here in this moment, Pilate is actually trying to confer upon them the legal ability to go and execute Jesus, but regardless of what's actually happening here, it's very obvious at some level that Pilate doesn't want to do this. Pilate is very resistant to carrying this out. He says, "You do this. I don't want to do this." And yet in verse 7, the Jews answered him, "We have a law. And according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." So what we see there in verse 7, it's almost like the crowd of Jewish people who were appealing to the Roman authorities. Remember, the Jewish people had no jurisdiction to carry out capital punishment. They had to have Roman authorization to do it. And so it's like in this moment, they realize that they're not allowed to take the man and to kill him, or at least for some reason they don't want to. And so they decide, we're going to switch our angle on Pilate and see if we can come at it from another way to get him to do what we want him to do. They've already tried really hard, and they're going to try again to convince Pilate that Jesus is a political threat. But to this point, that hasn't appeared to work. Pilate's looking at Jesus, and he apparently doesn't think that he's a threat to Caesar or that he's trying to run an insurrection. Because if he was, Pilate would be like, "Let's kill this guy, no problem." But apparently Pilate looked at him and was like, "This guy's not a problem. So I don't know what to do." So the Jews changed their angle a little bit, and they now instead appeal to Pilate's responsibility as a Roman official to uphold the law of the land, which was Jewish law. So the Roman Empire ruling over Jerusalem and the Jewish people at this time, their law was like supreme, but part of their law, part of their responsibility in the lands that they conquered was to uphold the law of the local people. And so they're like, "Hey, we've got a law on the books that says this guy should die." And their reason, they bring the charge that ultimately would be the reason that Jesus dies. They bring the charge of blasphemy. They say, "This man has made himself to be the Son of God." This is the true heart of the concern of the religious leaders. Jesus is making himself to be equal with God, they tell us in the Gospel of John. But again, here's the irony. You don't have to make yourself to be something that you are. You tracking with me? Imagine your boss calls you into his office and says, hey, your performance is lacking, and if it doesn't improve, I'm gonna have to let you go. You would be a fool to look at your boss and say, oh, look at you, making yourself out to be the boss. They're not making themselves out to be the boss, they're the boss. You don't have to make yourself to be something that you are. And the only reason that the charge of blasphemy against Jesus would hold any weight is if it wasn't true, what Jesus was saying. If he said, I'm the Son of God and I'm equal with God, I'm one with God, that's only blasphemy if it's false. But it's true. It is true. He is the Son of God. And when we call Jesus the Son of God, we are going far beyond what we might use as the generic sense, like, well, he's a child of God. No. Far beyond that. He is the unique, one and only, eternally existent, the only begotten Son of God, which means that he is the very nature and substance of God himself in a human body. He is the Son of God. That's why Colossians 2:9 can tell us, in him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell bodily. He is the fullness of God. He's the God who fills all eternity, and he is here standing in front of Pilate. Now, something happens here in the story that's, I think, very telling. Verse 8, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. So think about that for a moment. It means, first of all, he was already at least a little afraid. But then also think about what's passing through Pilate's mind right now. They say, okay, well, if you don't think he's a threat, they look at Pilate and say, our law says he should die because he says he's equal with God. Have you ever done something so foolish or evil or wrong, and then like immediately on the heels of doing it, you've become aware that other people know about it and potential consequences are on the way? Here's what I'm talking about. This has never happened to me. This is just totally hypothetical. But imagine a scenario in which, hypothetical, someone would be saying something very nasty about someone else. Something you would never say if they were in your presence. And then all of a sudden you turn around and you realize the whole time your yapper was hanging open, they were within earshot. And do you know that weird physical mixture of like guilt and shame and fear, like your stomach hurts and your cheeks go red and you're just like, oh, what have I done? Imagine if you were responsible for doing horrible violence to this man. And he's standing in front of you, beaten and bloodied. And then you hear the people who know him best say, he thinks he's equal with God. And it's like in that moment, Pilate experiences that fear. It's almost certainly connected to what Matthew tells us, that Pilate's wife came to him just before this and said, have nothing to do with that righteous man. I have suffered much on account of him in a dream today. He's examined him and he knows he's innocent. His wife has come to him and says, please don't do anything to him. He is a righteous man and I've been dreaming about him. And in this moment, he hears other people say, this man is the Son of God, or at least he says so. And it's like he's filled with dread. Because at some level, he knows what he's done, and maybe he even feels the weight of what he's about to do. What's so tragic, and here again is the tragic irony of this story. This fear in this moment should never have led Pilate to condemn Jesus. It should have caused him to worship Jesus. Pilate should have been, he was rightly filled with fear, and that fear should have driven him to his knees, where he says what the Roman soldier said when he saw Jesus die, surely this man was the Son of God. That's what Pilate should do in this scenario, but it is not what he does. And yet we who see Jesus and know who he is, we who in the upside down world of this passage are getting a glimpse into his true identity, we fall down before him and we worship him. We say he not only claimed to be the Son of God, he is the Son of God. And we assign ultimate value and worth to him. Something in your life this week is getting your ultimate allegiance. Something you are saying is of ultimate value to you. It could be anything. It could be your job, it could be a relationship, it could be money, it could be the opinion of other people, it could be this pursuit that you're chasing, this dream that you have, this possession that you are longing for. Whatever it is, that is what you are worshiping, friend. And this week, if you're seeing this passage appropriately, you should be drawn to worship Jesus as the eternal King, to say nothing else is worth to me what Jesus is worth to me, and worship him. We are the people who declare with our lips and our lives that this man that they mocked and killed is the one who is worthy of the highest esteem and eternal glory from God's people. We worship him. Here's the third response to his true identity. It's this: believe Jesus as the sovereign king. Verse 9, Pilate entered his headquarters again. On the heels of being filled with this dread, he goes back inside the praetorium, the place where he would have this Roman council. And imagine this. Sometimes the Bible is so funny. Just picture the moment. They say, this man makes himself out to be the Son of God. Pilate has a full-on existential crisis in his heart and his soul. And he goes back in the building. He's like, so where did you say you were from again? Can we just rewind back to the beginning? Where were you born? Where are you from? And you have to wonder if there was a note of panic in his voice. Where are you from? Why is all of this swirling around you? And why am I now caught in the middle? He's just trying to dig, to try to find and understand, where did you come from? And why are you here? And why is all this going on? And Jesus will give him no answer. No answer. Why? Well, I read this week. It was very helpful to me. Why will Jesus give Pilate no answer? Because Pilate has shown no interest in real understanding. He has contemptuously dismissed Jesus' claim to testify to the truth. So why should Jesus think that the governor is any more prepared for the truth now? What answer, long or brief, could Jesus have provided to the Roman prefect, who is more interested in political maneuvering than in justice, who displays superstitious fear but absolutely no remorse, and who in the next verses still struts on the stage of human power but is enslaved by the political threats of his frenzied opposition? That's why Jesus gives him no answer, because Pilate has proven that he's not actually looking for an answer. He's more worried about saving his skin and keeping his job than he is about doing what is right with Jesus. And here comes the strutting that was mentioned in that quote. Jesus' silence appears to agitate Pilate, and so he says to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Pilate looks at Jesus and he says, "I'm in charge." Now, sometimes, if you've ever raised a little boy, you will be familiar with this thing that they do. Sometimes they will try to kind of test the waters of authority by making ridiculous claims and just seeing if they work out. They'll just say things like they're trying to speak them into existence. The funniest one literally happened last night for the very first time. I'd never seen this before. We were at the dinner table, and my 2-year-old Jude, he reached over to Rachel, and he grabs her under the chin like this. He grabs her like this. And it was so cute and sweet. And he brings her face in close to him like this. And it looked like he was gonna give her a kiss or say, "I love you" or something. And he looks at her and he goes, "You're getting a consequence." Which was amazing. Sometimes as a parent, you shouldn't laugh, but you can't not. So we just bust up laughing. It's like he's saying it, just like wondering if it will materially appear in existence. Like, I am now the one who will wield authority and discipline in this family. You are getting a consequence. You've said it to me enough times. Now the tables are turned. You're getting a consequence. Like, it's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. It's like a desperate power grab, seeing if the words can make it actually come to pass, and it will never happen. Like a dictator whose empire is collapsing around him, feverishly grasping for power, as if saying it will make it true. I'm in charge. I'm in charge. I'm in charge. And Jesus, in response, just goes full savage mode. Look at what he says. He says, you would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Which is just awesome. He says, the only authority you have, Pilate, as much as you would like to proclaim, I'm in charge, the only authority you have has been given to you by my Father who is in heaven. He's telling him, you are not an independent operator who will have the final say in this outcome. This is all according to the plan of God and is operating according to a heavenly timeline. And this statement of Jesus in this moment is such a powerful reminder of this great truth. People can only ever do what God allows them to do. Now, I realize that might be an affront to your view of human freedom, and yet the Bible is resoundingly clear over and over and over and over again. There is not one human action in the entire span of human history that has ever superseded the sovereign will of God. People only ever do what God allows them to do. And maybe your first objection is like, well, what about really bad stuff? Consider what's happening in this moment. What's about to happen is the worst thing that has ever happened. And I'm not saying that as a hyperbole or an over-exaggeration. This is the spotless, innocent Son of God who is about to be crucified, having been brutally tortured and beaten. He's going to be hung on a cross to die. It is the worst thing that has ever happened. It is worse than any act of evil or crime against humanity. It is the spotless Son of God crucified. And yet, Jesus says, right in the middle of this scenario, even the ability for you to do this comes from God. And so we must always remember people are responsible for their actions. And yet, God is totally and ultimately sovereign over outcomes. And both those things are true. That's why reflecting on this verse, reflecting on this happening, this circumstance right here, when the apostles are praying in Acts chapter 4, they say this, for truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed. Here's all the opposition against Jesus. Herod, and then here's our character this week, Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel. And why were those people assembled, and what did they do? Acts 4:28 says this, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. Which just means this, everything that the opposition against Jesus did, they did because it was according to the plan of God. And that's what Jesus is saying. In this moment, where Jesus is ostensibly, he is under the authority of Pilate, Jesus makes it very clear, I am sovereign over the circumstances that it appears I am a victim of. I'm sovereign over this. And so the question for us today is, do you believe that Jesus is ultimately sovereign? Do you believe that he rules and he reigns? Do you believe that in his goodness and his wisdom and in his power, he has ultimate control over the course of human history and over the individual events of your life? And that he wills your good if you belong to him? That nothing has ever escaped his sight? That nothing slipped past his hand and got to you by accident? That he's sovereign? And do you trust him? Do you believe that he is sovereign, and do you respond appropriately? He is the sovereign king here in this circumstance, and he is the sovereign king always. And here's the fourth and final response to his true identity is this: recognize Jesus as the submissive king. Recognize Jesus as the submissive king. Pilate really wants to release Jesus, but he's kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. If he condemns Jesus, he knows he's condemning an innocent man, and if he releases Jesus, he's going to have an absolute riot on his hands. This murderous crowd knows exactly how to work Pilate in this moment, and the crowd knows that Pilate is kind of on thin ice. History tells us he had messed up a few times, and Tiberius Caesar, who was the ruler of the Roman Empire, had already reprimanded Pontius Pilate on more than one occasion, and so he is justifiably afraid of losing his job. And these people basically say to Caesar, Caesar will be very angry with you if you don't do what we want you to do. If you don't kill Jesus, then everything's going to get out of control, and you need to remember that because this man makes himself a king, he is an enemy of Caesar's. And you don't want to be seen giving favor to Caesar's enemies, do you? They're basically politically extorting Pilate. They're politically blackmailing him. They're saying, we'll go tell Caesar that there was an insurrectionist in your midst and you did nothing, and that's why everything went crazy. And they were exactly right. They knew that this is what motivated Pilate. And so Pilate, with all of his fear, with all of his agonizing over what to do, the text tells us he went out to the place of judgment to render a verdict. And he rendered a verdict over Jesus of guilty. It was not without one more protestation. Behold your king. And they said, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said, shall I crucify your king? Shall I crucify your king? The irony of this is that this is the man who's been punished. This is the man who's been whipped. This is the man who is bloodied and battered. And still Pilate is saying to them, this is your king. It's almost as if he is so bitter about the catch-22 that he's in that he's almost like mocking them. He's like saying, you people are so pathetic that this man is your king. Do you really want me to crucify your king? And with such a tragic accuracy, he was right. This actually was the king of the Jews, but his kingship at this moment didn't look like retaliation. It didn't look like removing himself from the situation. His kingship in this moment looked like submission. And yet, in maybe one of the saddest statements in this whole passage, the very people of God, like remember, this is the people of the covenant. These are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob who have received the promises of God. The one over whom God rules and reigns, the one to whom God said in Isaiah 43:15, I am the Lord, I am your Holy One, I am the creator of Israel, and I am your king. And those people, they let these words come out of their mouth. We have no king but Caesar. It's like the apostasy and the abandonment of God is complete in this murderous crowd. And they say, no one rules over us except the Roman Empire. We bow to Caesar. And it's because of their willingness to say that, and it's because of the position that Pilate is in, that Pilate finally condemns Jesus to death. And so verse 16 says, so he delivered him over to them to be crucified. And that right there is the end of the trial of Jesus, and the verdict has been rendered, though it is woefully inaccurate. He is guilty, and he will be sentenced to capital punishment, to death by crucifixion. And in this moment, what we see is that these people are treating him like a victim over which they are victorious and an enemy that they have defeated. And in actuality, what's happening is that he is submitting to the cross for the redemption of all of God's people. We've talked about this all along, but Jesus did not go to the cross as a helpless victim, he went to the cross as a purposeful savior. The Bible tells us over and over again that he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. From the moment of his incarnation and even well beyond that into eternity past, the cross was always the point of Jesus coming to earth. And so he was willing to submit to whatever it took to take him to that place where he would bear upon his shoulders the wrath and fury of God for all of the sin, for all time, for all of God's people, so that people like you and me could stand now before a holy God and be completely forgiven of everything we have ever done in rebellion against our Maker. So that you and I could be washed as white as snow and we could be redeemed and healed and restored and welcomed into God's family. We are the people who recognize that it is our submissive King Jesus who submitted himself all the way to the cross, who is the only one who makes a way for us to be rescued and saved and made right with our God. And so we recognize him. We see in this passage that during the trial of Jesus, it's the tragic irony that reveals his true identity. And my heart and my prayer for us today is that we would not treat him tragically, we would treat him appropriately. We would not treat him the way that he's not supposed to be treated. We would treat him according to what he deserves and who he is. That rather than mocking him and denigrating him and disregarding him, we would be the people who bow to him and who worship him and who believe in him and who recognize him and trust him, receiving the salvation that only he can offer, and then living renewed and transformed lives on the mission that he has left us for the glory of his name. Let's be the people who know his true identity, who don't fall victim to the tragic, dramatic irony, but see him as the sovereign, eternal Son of God and respond appropriately. Let's pray.